Welcome back to another episode of Ask the Hammer with Jeffrey Levine of Buckingham Wealth Partners. Jeffrey, I've got a question, and I'm hoping that it might, I'm hoping that you can give us a good answer on this one, and I'm certain you
Well,
can.
I hope so too.
Yeah. All right. So there's a reader that writes that they've been reading a lot about risk tolerance questionnaires, and
Sure.
they're somewhat cynical. They said, "Is this something that is used to protect a brokerage firm from me suing them if things go south?"
Wow, that's a great question. The answer is certainly yes. It is used to protect the brokerage firm or the advisory firm if things go south. But that's not to say that risk tolerance questionnaires aren't helpful. Now, in my opinion, the risk tolerance is really only one part of the issue. And then on top of that, there are varying degrees of effectiveness for risk tolerance questionnaires. In other words, some do a lot better job than others. So let me kind of take each of those in succession. First off, there are some people who will give you 3 questions that ask about, like, what would you do in this situation? What would you do in that? And that's effectively the risk tolerance. And there it is, in my opinion, just trying to get something down on a piece of paper for liability protection and to get a gauge perhaps of what your thoughts may be. But in large part, you're not really going to get a volume or a dearth of information from 3 questions. So there are certainly risk tolerance questionnaires, and there's about 10 or 15 different major software companies out now that all specialize in this area that have different flavors to it, if you will. Some do it a little bit differently. They measure on different scales. They ask slightly different questions, but they do an effective job of measuring risk tolerance. In other words, how risk averse are you? Your gut, right? Your stomach. I like to think of it as the stomach test. But then there's also a second part of how investing, how you should create your portfolio, I should say. And that's not just the risk tolerance. It's what's known as risk capacity. And risk capacity kind of, if you think of a standard chart, right, where you have the x-axis, or rather the x-axis and the y-axis, and you kind of plot a course based on where you fall on each side. Well, I like to think of risk tolerance on one side and risk capacity on the other, because they're really equally important. For instance, if you tell me, Jeff, I have X amount of dollars and I can't take any risk in the market, but I'd like to spend $100,000 a year in retirement. And the only way for us to reasonably get there, based on your income, based on the amount you can save, et cetera, is to hit a 7 or 8% annual return over the next 30 years. Well, you could tell me all you want that you're risk averse, but the only way we're ever going to get to your potential goal, the math, if you will, behind it, is saying we've got to be aggressive. Now, conservatively, think of, let's give a great example. Let's say you've got someone who's really comfortable with the market, and today, it's their lucky day. They win the lottery, the Powerball lottery. All of a sudden, they have, after tax, like $300 million in the bank. Now, they might have the capacity to take risk, right? Because they have all this money in the world. But what if they suddenly say, you know what, I was really risky, but I don't need to be anymore, right? In fact, I'm so risk averse, I don't want to lose any of my $300 million. Well, you could lose half for $300 million and still be really good. In fact, you could lose like 90% of your $300 million, right? Your capacity is extraordinarily high, but your risk tolerance may now be low. And the one thing I will add about risk tolerance questionnaires is that everybody's trying to get a sense of what you will do when things go well, but more importantly, when things go poorly. And while these things can be helpful and advisors can point to them and say, well, look, we talked about this before. Here's what your thought process was when you weren't, in this moment of heightened fear, et cetera. But at the end of the day, when you actually go through the situation versus when you sit down and do the test are 2 very different things. And oftentimes I've seen risk tolerance questionnaires that someone will say, yes, I'm willing to take the risk. And then when we get into the actual situation, the stomach starts to bubble a little bit more than perhaps they thought it would. And we saw a lot of examples of that earlier this year with such a swift market decline. Data shows actually that people didn't make too many poor decisions, that they actually stuck through more than maybe people would have expected. But at the end of the day, it's those combination of 2 things. It's the risk tolerance, which is valuable. It is worth knowing. how you feel about certain market situations, and combining that with your risk capacity to come up with the optimal portfolio solution for an individual.
Yeah, the thing that you remind me of is, obviously when the market went down 30% earlier this year, many people might have said, "Whoa, whoa, whoa! I didn't mean to be. I can't tolerate that kind of risk." But if you couple that with their risk capacity to say, "But I could also suffer this kind of dollar decline without it impacting my standard of living in retirement or wherever," then you balance those two, and you could say, well, it was a 30% decline, but it didn't affect me because I had the capacity to stomach to wither it.
Sure. Yeah, absolutely. And I think the one thing that really helped us earlier this year too was that decline was so fast. Now that sounds really bad, right? Like the decline was, but people didn't have a chance. They were so worried about, oh my God, am I losing my job, or am I sending my kids to a school? Where am I putting them if I'm not? They had so many other things on their mind that they were distracted, didn't have the time. And by the time people finally had the chance to focus on it, we'd actually largely recovered some of those losses and people felt a little more comfortable. So actually the speed of this decline, oddly enough, may have helped to contribute to the fact that people held on tight.
All right. Tough question. Great answer. Gets a hammer. Nailed it.